In 1976, the Chinese government became convinced that Bigfoot was real. They didn't call it Bigfoot, of course. They called it the Yeren, which translates literally as wild man. And in the spring of 1977, the Chinese Academy of Sciences mounted what is, to this day, the largest state-funded cryptid expedition in history. Over 100 personnel, paleoanthropologists, zoologists, biologists, photographers, and soldiers from the People's Liberation Army were sent into the mountains of central China to find it. They spent a year searching. They came back with footprints up to 38 centimeters long. They came back with hair samples that lab analysis couldn't classify. They came back with an eyewitness report from a farmer who stood face to face with one of these creatures for a full hour. What they didn't come back with is a body. And what happened in those mountains between the soldiers, the scientists, and whatever was out there has been almost completely buried in the West. This is a story of how the Chinese government hunted Bigfoot and what they actually found.
I'm Alex. This is your channel for honest analysis of the world's strangest cryptid cases. Today, we're not in North America. We are in central China, looking at the most ambitious cryptid hunt any government has ever attempted. Let's get into it.
Before we go any further, let me be straight with you about why I think this story matters. If you spend any time in cryptid media, books, documentaries, channels like this one, you'll notice the same handful of creatures get all the attention. American Bigfoot, the Himalayan Yeti, the occasional Almasty from the Caucasus if a channel is feeling adventurous. That's about it. The Chinese Yeren almost never comes up. And that's strange because the Chinese government once treated this creature more seriously than the American government has ever treated Bigfoot, than the British government has ever treated the Loch Ness Monster, or than the Canadian government has ever treated Sasquatch. The Chinese Academy of Sciences, the country's most prestigious scientific body, funded multiple state expeditions over 5 years. They sent in the People's Liberation Army. They offered rewards for a live specimen. I personally think the way the West ignores the Yeren tells us more about us than it does about the creature. We pay attention to the cryptids we grew up with. We don't pay attention to the ones that live in places we don't understand. If you watched my Soviet Yeti video from a few weeks back, you already know I have a soft spot for the state-funded cryptid story. China's version is, in some ways, more extreme than the Soviet program. The Soviet Snowman Commission was an academic body. The Chinese program had the army. Here's the thing that surprised me most when I started digging into this. The Yeren is not a modern invention. It is not a Cold War folk creation. It is not something that emerged with the 1960s wave of cryptozoology. The Yeren has documented written references going back roughly 2,500 years. The earliest written reference is the poem Mountain Spirit by the poet Yeren from the Warring States period around the 3rd century BC. Yeren describes hairy mountain dwellers in the regions south of the Yangtze. He doesn't call them Yeren, that name came later, but the description maps closely onto what later writers would describe. Fast forward to the Ming Dynasty. In 1555, a local gazette called the Fangxianji was published in Fang County, which is in modern-day Hubei province, the same province where the 1977 expedition would later go. The gazette describes a group of Yeren living in mountain caves, preying on village dogs and chickens. This is, as far as I can find, the first written use of the word Yeren itself. In 1578, Li Shizhen, the most influential Chinese physician of his era, published his Compendium of Materia Medica. It became the foundational text of traditional Chinese medicine and is still studied today. In it, Li Shizhen mentions Yeren and similar ape men alongside the rest of the natural world. This was not a folk tradition appearing in a folk text. This was a scientific reference work of its era. 200 years later, in 1781, the poet Yuan Mei wrote a collection of strange tales called Xin Qi Xie. In it, he describes Moran, hairy men, as being a monkey-like, but not actual monkeys. That distinction is important. Yuan Mei was a careful writer. He's specifically noting that these creatures resemble apes, but are categorically not apes. There's also a rural Hubei folk tradition worth mentioning because it shows up in old local histories. According to this tradition, the Yeren are the descendants of laborers conscripted to build the Great Wall who fled into the mountains during construction, went feral, and never came back to civilization. I want to be honest, that's folklore explaining the creature, not evidence for it. But it shows that the people who live in the region have been thinking about this for a long time. I personally think this depth matters. American Bigfoot as a mainstream cultural figure is essentially a 20th century phenomenon. The name Bigfoot itself comes from a 1958 newspaper article about Jerry Crew's tracks in Bluff Creek, California. The Yeren has written documentation going back to the Ming Dynasty, and oral tradition going back further than that. That kind of depth should at least make us pause before we file the whole tradition under modern folklore. The modern Yeren story, the part that brought the Chinese Academy of Sciences in, begins on a remote road in central China in late May of 1976. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the political environment. This was the final months of the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong was still alive. He would die in September of that same year. For a decade, the Chinese government had aggressively suppressed anything categorized as superstition, folk traditions, religious practice, anything seen as backward or pre-revolutionary. Stories about hairy wild men in the mountains were exactly the kind of thing officials were supposed to dismiss. So what happened on that road was the worst possible thing to happen at the worst possible political moment. 6 men were driving home late at night from a Communist Party meeting at the Shenongjia Regional Forestry Committee. The road was a remote stretch between Fang County and the small village of Chunshui in northern Hubei province. The headlights of their car caught something in the road. It didn't move. They stopped. 3 of them got out, and they walked within 1 meter of it, close enough to touch. The deputy director of the committee, a man named Chen Liansheng, would later file the official report about what they saw. His words are on the record. He said, quote, "We stopped about 1 meter away from the animal. 3 of us in total got out of the car. It was so near that we could touch it." His description of the creature was specific. Covered in red fur, face human-like with upright ears and a protruding mouth, eyes that did not reflect light the way human eyes do. Thin arms but a lower body that was, in his words, very thick like a cow. No tail. According to the account preserved in the case files, one of the officials, not Chen, one of the others, threw a rock at it. The creature ran into the trees. They returned to the spot the next day and collected reddish hairs from the ground. Those hairs were sent to Beijing. Chen filed his report up the chain of command.
6 Communist Party officials, not hunters, not cryptid believers, but politicians with careers to protect. And they filed a report saying that they got within arm's reach of this thing. In 1976, China. That's not a report you file lightly.
Now, the skeptics read on this as straightforward. The witnesses were tired. It was night. They may have seen a sun bear, which is found in southern China and can walk bipedally over short distances. They may have seen a red-haired man, possibly someone with congenital hypertrichosis, and exaggerated. Memory is unreliable, especially under stress. I take those arguments seriously. But I also notice that Chen Liansheng's description doesn't match any known animal cleanly. Sun bears have tails. They don't have protruding mouths in the way Chen described. and Chen, as a senior party official in a remote forestry district, would have known what a sun bear looked like. These weren't city people who'd never seen wildlife. 6 witnesses, 1 meter of distance, physical hairs collected, an official report filed. That's what landed on a desk in Beijing in the fall of 1976. What happened next required a very specific political shift. In September of 1976, Mao Zedong died. The Cultural Revolution effectively ended over the following months. The new leadership opened the country cautiously to scientific inquiries that had been impossible under the old regime. In that window, let's call it late 1976 through early 1977, the Chen Liansheng report worked its way through the system. It was not the only Yeren report on file. The Beijing Natural History Museum had been quietly collecting accounts from rural villagers for years. The 1976 encounter became the focal point that gave a generation of researchers permission to ask out loud what they had been thinking about privately. What happened in scientific and popular circles became known in retrospect as Yeren fever. Newspapers picked it up. Villagers across multiple provinces began coming forward with their own accounts. By the spring of 1977, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the country's most prestigious scientific body, had formally committed to a state-funded expedition. The leadership of that expedition is worth taking a moment to introduce because these are real people with real careers, and their names should be remembered. The co-lead of the expedition was Zhou Guoqing, an anthropologist from the Beijing Natural History Museum. By 1977, Zhou was an established researcher with a reputation to protect. He took on the project with what later researchers describe as cautious open-mindedness. The program's most public advocate was Yuan Zhenqin, a paleoanthropologist with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Yuan would become the Chinese equivalent of Boris Porshnev, the Soviet hominologist I covered in my Soviet Yeti video. Yuan spent the rest of his career on this question. He believed until the end of his life that the Yeren was real, and most likely a surviving relative of Gigantopithecus, the extinct giant ape whose fossils have been found in the same part of China. Working alongside Yuan was Huang Wanpo. Yuan and Huang would co-author the program's foundational academic paper titled A Challenge to Science, The Mystery of the Wild Man. It was published in 1979 and translated into English shortly after. The personnel committed to the 1977 expedition was over 100 people. Zoologists, biologists, photographers, journalists, and significantly, soldiers from the People's Liberation Army. The Army's role was largely logistical, providing security, handling transport through terrain where no roads existed, and securing the camps. But the political signal of involving the Army was clear. The state was treating this as a serious matter. The target area was Shenangjia Forestry District in western Hubei. To get a sense of what they were walking into, Shenangjia is a county-sized administrative unit that occupies about 3,253 square kilometers of mountain forest. The peaks reach over 3,000 meters in elevation. Even today, the resident population is around 74,000 people scattered across the entire district. In 1977, it was even more remote. I personally think a government willing to commit anthropologists, biologists, and soldiers to a year-long mountain expedition for any reason is making a statement. This wasn't a casual inquiry. This was an investment of state resources you don't make on a whim. And I saw some of you in the comments on my Soviet Yeti video pointing out that every government with mountains seems to eventually run into one of these stories. You weren't wrong. The expedition began work in the spring of 1977. They were on the ground in Shenangjia by early summer. And while they were operating, an event happened a few hundred kilometers away that would become the most cited single account in the program's official record. The date was June 6th, 1977. The location was the Qinling Taibishan Reserve in Shanxi Province, just north of Hubei. The witness was a farmer named Pang Gensheng. According to Pang's account, which was investigated directly by expedition members in the months that followed, he was working alone in the forest when he came face to face with a hairy, upright creature. He estimated the height at 2.3 meters, about 7.5 feet. The creature did not attack him. Pang did not flee. Instead, the two of them stood facing each other for a full hour. This is the detail to sit with. Most claimed cryptid encounters last seconds, a few last a couple of minutes. An hour is something else entirely. An hour is operational time. It's enough time to study someone, to assess them, to know them. After what Peng estimated as an hour, the standoff broke. Peng picked up a rock, the standard rural Chinese reaction to a threatening animal, and hit the creature in the chest. The creature ran into a nearby ditch and disappeared down it. As it left, it was muttering something that sounded to Pang like the syllables, "Goro, Goro."
An hour. They stood face to face for 1 hour. Most cryptid encounters last seconds. An hour is long enough to study someone, long enough to know them, understand them. I personally don't know what to do with that information.
The Peng Gensheng account became the spine of what the 1977 expedition published. It's cited in Yuan Zhenshin and Huang Wanpo's 1979 paper. It's cited in Zhou Guoqing's 1982 article in the journal Cryptozoology. It was investigated in detail by the expedition team, and the witness was interviewed multiple times by trained anthropologists. What's worth understanding about Pang Gensheng is who he was. He wasn't a known storyteller. He wasn't a man with a history of unusual claims. He was a farmer in a remote reserve, the kind of witness who, in a different country, would simply never have been heard. The only reason his name is preserved at all is that the Chinese Academy of Sciences sent trained people to find him, to sit with him in his home, and to take his account seriously enough to write it down. Expedition interviewers reportedly asked Pang to walk them through the encounter multiple times across separate visits, checking for consistency. The standard journalistic practice for evaluating a witness account, which is repeating the question and seeing if the story holds, was applied carefully here. According to the published records, Pang's account held. The details didn't drift. The hour estimate, the description, the Goro syllables, all of it stayed consistent across retellings. The Goro detail is the part I personally cannot explain away. It is not a recognizable word in any Chinese dialect. It is not a stock feature of Yeren folklore. It is not what a person fabricating an encounter would invent. If you're making this up, you say the creature howled or screamed or roared. You don't invent the syllables Goro. It's too specific, too weird, too useless as a storytelling detail. I have to give the skeptical view here because that's the deal on this channel. Pang Gensheng could have been mistaken, he could have been hallucinating. The hour estimate could be wrong since time perception under stress is famously unreliable. The detail about it, muttering Goro, could be a memory artifact. All of this is possible. But the part that doesn't pass the smell test for me as an invention is what didn't happen. They stood and looked at each other. Neither attacked, neither fled. That's not how a fabricated cryptid story is supposed to go. That's how a real encounter with a cautious wild animal sometimes goes. The 1977 expedition operated in the field for roughly a year. So what does a 100-person cryptid expedition actually do day to day? The first job was eyewitness interviews. The expedition team systematically worked through the surrounding counties, Fang, Badong, Xingshan, plus districts in neighboring Shanxi. They sat with farmers, hunters, school teachers, and Communist Party officials, recording accounts of past sightings. They documented hundreds of these interviews. Some accounts dated back decades. The second job was tracking. Team members worked through known sighting locations on foot, looking for physical evidence. They found footprints in mud, in snow, in soft forest soil. They made plaster casts. They photographed prints they couldn't cast. They documented stride length and depth, trying to estimate weight and movement patterns. The third job was collection. They gathered hair samples from sighting sites, hair caught on bark, hair caught on thorns, hair embedded in mud at footprint sites. They collected suspected scat. They photographed what some accounts described as nests, structures of bent vegetation that didn't match anything known to local zoologists. The soldiers' role in all this was, as I mentioned, mostly logistical. They handled transport through terrain where roads didn't exist. They set up the base camps. They handled security at night, which mattered in a region where leopards and Asian black bears were still active. They were, in effect, the infrastructure that made the science possible. As the interviews accumulated, a consistent pattern emerged from the eyewitness reports. The descriptions were remarkably similar across hundreds of unrelated witnesses in remote villages, with no shared media tradition before 1976. The pattern was height between 2 and 2.4 meters, which is 6 to 8 feet. Hair-colored reddish-brown, occasionally gray, occasionally black. Bipedal, walking upright. A flat face described as more human than ape. Long arms reaching to the knees. Females reported with human-like mammary glands. That's a detail that recurs and matters because it doesn't match the anatomy of most great apes, reported as nocturnal, omnivorous, with yelling vocalizations. Two specific sightings investigated by the expedition are worth mentioning because they help calibrate what the team was actually working with. On June 19th, 1976, a witness reported a Yeren from a distance of about 20 feet in a wooded area. On July 21, 1977, while the expedition was active in the field, another witness reported a Yeren from about 12 feet, though there was a ditch between the witness and the creature obstructing part of the view. These aren't dramatic encounters by cryptid standards. They're the kind of mid-distance, partially obstructed sightings that any honest researcher would categorize as suggestive but inconclusive. The expedition didn't pretend they were anything else. I personally think the consistency of these accounts across witnesses who had no contact with each other is one of the more genuinely difficult data points to dismiss. Either hundreds of Chinese mountain villagers across multiple provinces are all describing the same real animal, or rural Chinese imagination has produced a spectacularly convergent fictional creature. Both are possible. I find the first slightly easier to believe than the second. By late 1977, the expedition was wrapping its first phase. The team began compiling the report that would be submitted to the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The findings were substantial but inconclusive. Here's what they had: footprint casts, numerous casts of large prints from sighting sites across the region. The standard size was around 30 centimeters in length with an 8 centimeter heel width. To compare, the average adult male human foot is about 26 centimeters. A separate cast taken during a later 1980 expedition would measure 38 centimeters, about 15 inches. Hair samples. The lab analysis came back mixed. Some samples matched known animals, including Asian black bears and Sichuan snub-nosed monkeys, common species in the region. But other samples, according to follow-up reporting, were declared unidentifiable using existing taxonomic references. Yuan Zhenshin would maintain until the end of his career that the bear classification had been ruled out for the most distinctive samples. Scat, collected, analyzed with similarly mixed results. Nest structures, photographed and documented but not formally identified. Hundreds of eyewitness accounts formally recorded and archived. What the expedition did not have was a body. They had no bones, they had no clear photograph, they had no living captive. After a year in the field with over 100 personnel, they did not have the single piece of evidence that would have closed the case in either direction. In a detail I find darkly funny, the 1977 expedition was later described by its own organizers as counterproductive because it was too large. So many people moving through the forest disturbed the wildlife and made the target species harder to find. If you were trying to locate a creature famously cautious around humans, sending 100 humans into its forest may not have been the optimal approach. But the lack of a body did not end the program. The Chinese Academy of Sciences would commit to 2 more major expeditions in 1980 and 1981. The 1980 expedition was responsible for the 38-centimeter footprint cast I mentioned. The 1981 expedition was the last of the major state-funded efforts. After that, funding tapered off. The 1980 expedition was structured differently from the 1977 one. Smaller teams, more focused tracking, less reliance on mass coverage. They worked in the same general region of Shenongjia, but split into multiple search parties. One of those parties, led by a researcher named Meng Qingbao, reportedly found something close to 1,000 footprints across about 1.5 miles of forest terrain. The clearest cast they took measured over 45 centimeters, that's roughly 18 inches. For comparison, a US men's size 15 shoe is about 13 inches. A reward system was established to incentivize villagers and hunters to bring in evidence. According to reporting from the period, the Chinese Academy of Sciences offered a cash reward for a dead Yeren specimen and twice as much for a live one. The numbers in the original sources are a little hard to pin down in modern dollar terms, but the gesture itself is what matters. This was a serious state offer. People searched for years. Nobody ever collected. I personally think this is the part of the story that deserves the most attention. 3 state-funded expeditions over 5 years, soldiers, scientists, lab analysis, reward money for a live specimen. And nothing closed it. There are really only 2 readings of that result, and I find both of them interesting. Either the entire program was one of the great wild goose chases in 20th century scientific history, or it produced evidence of a creature so behaviorally cautious that even a military-backed effort couldn't pin it down to a body. I don't know which is true, I just know nothing closed. It is itself a striking result. There's a story from 1980 that I want to include carefully because it's in the official record, but I personally have reservations about it. The story is this. A hunter named Bu Xiaoqiu, working in Rongshui County in Guizhou Province in 1980, claimed to have caught a small Yeren, by his description, a juvenile. According to his account, he had it, he could have brought it back, he could have collected the reward, he let it go. His stated reason on the record was that when he had it caught, its eyes filled with tears. Now here's why this account matters scientifically. Emotional tear production, tears produced in response to feeling rather than in response to physical irritation, is a uniquely human trait as far as current research can determine. Other primates can express distress, other primates can vocalize when caught, but tears as an emotional response are something we know only in our own species. So Bu Xiaoqiu's account, if it's accurate, suggests that what he caught was not just an unknown ape. It suggests something with a human-type emotional response. Now, I'll be honest with you about my hesitation. This is the kind of story that fits the cryptid genre too well. A single witness, no corroboration, an emotionally resonant detail that makes for a great story but isn't physically verifiable. I'm not vouching for Bu Xiaoqiu. I'm telling you what's in the record. I include it because it's part of the documented history of the Chinese Yeren research period. I personally treat it as a low-confidence data point. But the fact that it was taken seriously enough to be recorded in academic literature on the topic, that's worth knowing. This is a good place to take a quick break before we get to the second strange encounter from this period, and to one of the most important reframings in the whole story. If you've been finding this useful so far, hit the like button and drop a comment with which detail has surprised you most. I read those. A year before the Bu Xiaoqiu account, in September of 1979, a cow herd named Zhou Yongfa was working in Fang County, the same county where Chen Liansheng's officials had their 1976 encounter. According to Zhou's account, a Yeren approached him in the woods. It did not attack, it did not flee. It walked up to him and took hold of his wrist. It held his wrist for half an hour. And then, according to Zhou, it laughed. This is one of those moments where I have to step back and tell you what I see. There's a pattern across cryptid traditions worldwide that I keep running into. The Almasty of the Caucasus is reported with weeping behavior. The Sasquatch is reported with what witnesses describe as intentional communication, head cocks, eye contact, deliberate gestures. The Yeren is reported with laughter. The Yowie in Australia is reported with human-like vocalizations. There are two ways to read this pattern, and they're very different. The first reading is that these creatures, whatever they are, share some behavioral overlap with humans that suggests a closer relationship than we'd expect from a great ape. Laughter, weeping, intentional communication, these would be characteristics of a hominid much closer to us than to gorillas or chimps. The second reading, and this is the one I personally lean toward, is that human witnesses project human traits onto unknown beings. We are deeply pattern-seeking creatures. When we don't understand what we're looking at, we explain it in human terms. The laughter Zhou Yongfa reports might be a vocalization that he interpreted as laughter because his brain had no other category for it. I want to be clear here, I'm flagging this pattern because it's interesting, not because it proves anything. The pattern could mean the witnesses are picking up something real. It could also mean every human brain pattern matches the same way when confronted with the unknown. Either explanation is in its own way worth thinking about. So if the Yeren is a real animal, what is it? This is where the Chinese research program produced its most respected hypothesis. And it requires me to introduce you to an animal that almost certainly existed and that lived in the exact area where the Yeren is reported. Gigantopithecus blacki, a real fossil ape, a genuine, documented, scientifically uncontroversial species. The first fossils were identified in 1935 by the German paleontologist Ralph von Koenigswald, who bought a fossilized tooth from a Hong Kong apothecary. The tooth was huge, too big for any known primate. The story of Koenigswald's discovery is worth telling on its own, because it tells you something about how easy it would be for a real animal to hide in plain sight in this part of the world. Traditional Chinese medicine has, for centuries, used ground fossil bones and teeth as ingredients and remedies. The trade in what's called dragon bones is an ancient one. Koenigswald was walking through apothecary shops in Hong Kong in the 1930s, looking through their inventory of fossilized teeth and bones being sold for medicinal use, when he spotted a single tooth that didn't belong. Too big for a known primate, too distinctive in shape to match anything in the existing taxonomy. He bought it. That tooth became the type specimen for the entire species. Think about that for a second. The largest primate ever to have existed was discovered because one of its teeth ended up in a traditional medicine shop. How many more teeth, how many more pieces of evidence have been ground up and consumed as medicine over the past 2,000 years? The fossil record of this animal is necessarily incomplete in a way most fossil records aren't. Subsequent fossil discoveries have given us a clearer picture. Gigantopithecus blacki was an enormous ape that lived in southern China and Southeast Asia. Estimates of its size are mostly inferred from the dimensions of jaw bones and teeth, but the consensus is roughly 9 to 10 feet tall when standing, weighing somewhere around half a ton. It's the largest known primate ever to have lived. The fossil evidence is limited to teeth and jaw bones. No skeletal remains have been found. That's not unusual for a large ape that lived in subtropical jungle environments. Soft tissue and bone don't survive well in those conditions. But the teeth and jaws we do have are abundant, geographically clustered, and unambiguously identifiable. For decades, the scientific consensus was that Gigantopithecus blacki went extinct roughly 500,000 years ago. Then, in early 2024, a major study published in Nature dramatically revised that estimate. The new dating put the extinction event at approximately 215,000 to 295,000 years ago, about half the previously assumed timeline. In paleontological terms, that's startlingly recent. Modern humans were already evolving in Africa by that point. Now here's the part where this connects to the Yeren story. Yuan Zhenshin's central hypothesis throughout his career was that the Yeren is a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, or a closely related descendant species. The argument is that this giant ape was thought extinct but might have persisted in the most remote, inaccessible mountain regions of southern China. The fossil evidence puts the species in the exact area where the Yeren is reported. The size matches the eyewitness descriptions. The geographic range fits. For those of you who watched my earlier Bigfoot videos, this hypothesis should sound familiar. The American anthropologist Grover Krantz proposed the same idea for Sasquatch, that Sasquatch might be a surviving Gigantopithecus population that crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene. Krantz spent decades on that hypothesis. The Chinese version of the same argument is, in some ways, more defensible, because the fossil evidence is geographically tighter. I personally think the Gigantopithecus hypothesis is the cleanest scientific argument any cryptid tradition has put forward. It connects real fossil evidence to living folklore in the same geographic region. That doesn't make it true, but it makes it more defensible than most cryptid claims you'll hear on this channel or any other. The skeptical view has to be represented here because I try to be fair on this. Daniel Loxton and Donald Prothero, in their book Abominable Science, lay out the problems with this hypothesis cleanly. The fossil record between Gigantopithecus and the present has a 200,000-year-plus gap with no transitional remains. Gigantopithecus was, as best we can tell from tooth wear, a specialized bamboo eater, which doesn't match Yeren descriptions of omnivorous behavior. And the geographic stretch from a southern Chinese ape to a Pacific Northwest Sasquatch is a long one. These are legitimate problems. I take them seriously. The most interesting character in this whole story, for my money, is Zhou Guoqing. He's the anthropologist who co-led the 1977 expedition. He went into this open-minded. He spent decades on it. And his intellectual journey is the most honest data point we have about what the evidence actually supports. Zhou's position in 1977 was cautious openness. He thought the case for an unknown primate was worth investigating. He thought the evidence accumulated by the expedition, the consistent eyewitness descriptions, the footprint casts, the unidentifiable hair samples, was suggestive enough to merit serious work. By the early 2000s, his position had shifted. After 3 expeditions, decades of fieldwork, and no body, Joe had become significantly more skeptical. In a 2012 publication, he estimated the probability that the Yeren is an unknown primate at approximately 5%. His direct quote from that period, "No direct proof of the existence of the wild man was found," plus the warning that the wild man simply may not exist. But here's the part that I keep coming back to. He did not say 0. In 2008, Zhou traveled back to Shenangjia with the American anthropologist Jeff Meldrum, the same Jeff Meldrum I've covered on this channel before, the one whose work on Sasquatch footprints I genuinely respect. The two of them interviewed a park ranger named Yuan Yu Hao, who claimed he had observed a Yeren at a distance of about 500 meters. The creature, he said, was sunning itself on rocks. Yuan Yu Hao provided footprint casts. They were 38 centimeters long, 16.5 centimeters wide at the ball of the foot, and 10 centimeters wide at the heel. Meldrum analyzed the casts in detail. His conclusion: the prints showed human-like plantigrade locomotion, 5 toes without claws, and what he called a mid-tarsal pressure ridge, a feature consistent with the ichnotaxon he had previously proposed for Sasquatch footprints, Anthropoidipes ameriborealis. Meldrum and Zhou published their joint analysis in the Relict Hominoid Inquiry in 2012. The paper was carefully hedged. Zhou maintained his 5% estimate, but the fact that he wrote it at all, the fact that he traveled to Shenangjia with Meldrum in 2008, that he interviewed Yuan Yu Hao, that he co-authored an analysis of footprint casts late in his career when he could easily have retired, tells you something the 5% number doesn't.
This is the part that gets me. The man who spent his whole career on this and grew more skeptical the longer he did, still won't say 0. 5% from a lifetime skeptical is heavier than 95% from a believer. That's just how I read this.
The most honest reading of Zhou Guoqing's position, I think, is that he saw enough during his career to keep him from closing the door, but not enough to walk through it. That's a position I respect. It doesn't make a good viral headline, but it's where serious researchers end up on a lot of these questions, and it should count for something. State funding for Yeren research effectively ended in the early 1980s. The Chinese Academy of Sciences quietly distanced itself from the program. The third expedition's results were similar to the first two: interesting evidence, no body, no clothes in the case. But the work didn't fully stop, it just went private. In 1994, Yuan Zhenqin helped found a group called the Strange and Rare Animals Exploration and Investigation Committee. The committee continued to investigate sightings, collect samples, and offer rewards for a specimen. It still exists, though funding has been a chronic problem. Yuan, in interviews late in his life, mentioned that he and a few colleagues have been forced to dig into their own pockets to keep 3 informal research centers operating. One of his colleagues reportedly divorced his wife, sold his house, and moved to Shenangjia permanently to continue the work alone. That detail, the colleague who sold everything and moved to Shenangjia to continue searching, has stuck with me since I first read it. This was a man who had a career, a home, a marriage. He gave it all up to spend the rest of his life walking the same mountain trails the army had already walked, looking for a creature that the Chinese government had quietly stopped looking for. Either he was the most committed crank in modern Chinese cryptozoology, or he had seen something during his expedition work that he could not get out of his head. I personally don't know which is true, but you don't make that kind of decision on a whim. In 2010, a separate group called the Hubei Wild Man Research Association mounted a private expedition. According to reporting at the time, the expedition cost about 11 million RMB to organize, roughly $1.6 million at the exchange rate then. The results were similar to every other expedition: interesting evidence, no body. There's one figure from the modern period I want to mention because his story stands on its own. Zhang Jingxing was an amateur Yeren researcher who spent over 2 decades living as a hermit in Shenongjia. He vowed not to shave his beard until he found a Yeren. He ran a private museum of Yeren evidence, footprint casts, hair samples, photographs until recently. According to local reporting, Zhang left Shenongjia mysteriously and closed his museum without explanation. He had never seen a Yeren himself. He told interviewers that the creature was his love and that he was destined to find it. He didn't. That's the story. The official sighting count today, according to Xinhua's 2018 reporting, is over 400. Local estimates run much higher. Most modern sightings are now in the same general area, Shenongjia and the surrounding mountains. Shenongjia itself was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016. The Yeren tradition is now a tourism asset for the region. You can buy hiking boots named after the creature. There's a life-size Yeren statue in the local Natural History Museum. The same thing happened in Willow Creek, California with Sasquatch. A serious cryptid mystery over time becomes a cottage industry. Some of that I find unfortunate, some of it I think keeps the question alive in a culture that would otherwise forget. The 2024 Gigantopithecus redating I mentioned earlier has, interestingly, reopened the academic conversation. If the giant ape survived in southern China until 215,000 years ago instead of 500,000, then the question of whether close relatives might have survived even longer is no longer obviously absurd. It's not a vindication of the Yeren hypothesis, but it is a development that changes the math. I personally do not know if the Yeren is real. I'm being honest with you, I genuinely don't. But what I do know is that this was not a fringe topic. It was the institutional position of the Chinese Academy of Sciences for half a decade. It was investigated by serious paleoanthropologists for their entire careers. The People's Liberation Army was committed to it. That alone deserves more attention than the English-language cryptid space has given it. So that's the story. The largest state-funded cryptid expedition in human history, run by the Chinese Academy of Sciences across 5 years and 3 major operations. Footprints up to 38 centimeters. Hair samples that resisted classification. An hour-long standoff with a farmer in Shaanxi. A hunter who let a juvenile go because it cried. A cow herd grabbed by the wrist for half an hour and then laughed at. And not a single body to close the case.
I do not know if the Yeren is real. I am being honest with you. I just do not. But I know this wasn't fringe science. The Chinese Academy of Sciences committed 5 years to it. The People's Liberation Army committed soldiers to it. That deserves to be on this channel. And in the comments, I want to hear what you think.
Comment below, do you think the Yeren is the same species as the Sasquatch, just on a different continent? A separate hominid lineage that evolved independently? Misidentified bears? Folk tradition built on stress and shadow? I want to hear it. Some of the best material on this channel has come from things you've pointed me toward in the comments. If you haven't watched my Soviet Yeti video yet, that's the natural next step from this one. The same general beat, a different continent, a different government, the same mystery. And if you want more from the Yeren research period, I'll probably come back to this. There's more here than fits in one video. Yuan Zhenchen and Zhou Guoqing each had careers worth their own deep dive.
I'm Alex, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.